When you think of Hawaii, you probably think of a vacation paradise. Beaches, surfing, hula dancing, and grass skirts. Well, that's how we think of Hawaii today. But back in 1941, it was different. Back then, on December 7th, 1941, this vacation paradise became a battlefield. Right here on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, a horrendous attack on America took place. It was similar to what we experienced on September 11th, 2001. So what was going on? Who attacked us, and why? After the attack on Pearl Harbor, a lot of Americans volunteered to defend our country from this new enemy. Maybe one of them was an older relative of yours. Thousands paid the ultimate price so that our freedoms would endure. Their sacrifices should never be forgotten, and they won't be. The Pennsylvania Veterans Museum is dedicated to keeping their stories alive through interviews with the veterans who served. In this video, you'll hear from those heroes who saw combat during World War II in the Pacific. Their stories are awe-inspiring. Before I explain what happened in Hawaii and how that got us into World War II, let's take a look at a world map from that time. In the early 1940s, Hawaii was a U.S. territory way off in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It wasn't even a state back then. But because it was the closest chain of islands to America's west coast, it was a good place for our military bases. Oahu, that's the island where Honolulu is, was home to dozens of American military installations. The largest of these was the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. On just about any day in 1941, Pearl Harbor would be busy with the Navy's biggest, most modern warships, either being refueled, resupplied, or repaired. But when the fleet was in, the heavy cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and the pride of the American Navy, the big monster battleships, Pearl Harbor would be jam-packed. And that's exactly the way it was on December 7th, 1941.
I was down, as I say, actually in my bunk when the first shot was fired. And when it started happening, the crew just run on top side, and for about 5 minutes we just startled, as if we were watching the circus or something, until it finally sunk in what the hell was happening. When they seen that red circle, they says, uh-oh, these ain't our boys.
That red circle was the center of the Japanese flag. It was painted on the sides of the Japanese planes, all 360 of them. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. They swarmed down on Pearl Harbor early in the morning like a horde of angry wasps. When the Japanese got off their last shot and flew away, less than 2 hours later, Pearl Harbor was a blazing inferno. Much of our Pacific Fleet was either sunk or turned into fireballs. Battleship Row took the biggest pounding. All 8 of the Navy's most powerful battleships were sunk or heavily damaged. The only part of the Navy fleet not affected were the aircraft carriers, which were on maneuvers at sea.
When we came out of the harbor, we actually passed all Battleship Row, so we seen that stuff just laying there, and it shook you up, that's for sure.
But it wasn't just the Navy that the Japanese targeted. Nearby Pearl Harbor at Hickam Airfield, they bombed almost 200 bombers and fighter planes as they just sat on the ground. It all happened too quickly for pilots to react. The death toll was unbelievable. 2,400 sailors, Marines, soldiers, airmen, and civilians were killed. Just to give you some perspective, there were 2,752 people killed on 9/11. In both attacks, there was a terrible loss of life. The Bataan Death March, as it was called, got us boiling mad. Everyone wanted to strike back at Japan any way we could. It didn't take long. About a week later, on April 18th, a squadron of American B-25 bombers showed up over the skies of Japan's capital, Tokyo. Their mission? Bomb military installations. The Japanese were stunned. They couldn't believe the Americans were capable of launching an attack on the Japanese mainland. Remember, this was only 5 months after Pearl Harbor. The bombers were launched from the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. The daring and dangerous secret mission was hatched by President Roosevelt himself with the help of his military commanders. Army Air Corps Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle led the training and mission. Some of these brave men standing here gave their lives for this mission. Now, in actual fact, the Doolittle raid didn't do a lot of damage to Tokyo. The group of 16 B-25s only had enough fuel for one bombing run, but the mission seriously rattled the Japanese high command and gave Americans a much-needed morale boost. It was lucky for the U.S. that the aircraft carriers were at sea during the Pearl Harbor attack, or Doolittle's raid might never have happened. The use of the Hornet in the raid showed how useful the aircraft carriers could be to the Navy. At the time, carriers weren't considered nearly as important or as powerful as battleships and cruisers. But aircraft carriers were pretty much all we had right after Pearl Harbor. Now the war in the Pacific would be dominated by these carriers and by the planes they transported.